looking at some of the key differences in these terms of reference that the college has sent in comparison to the old one. And that has largely to do with ratification, which is probably going to stimulate some conversation. And I'm just going to share my screen. I'm going to bring us right to a table that's in that guideline. We can talk certainly about other aspects of change or things that are new or coming as a result of these guidelines now. And then there are things that have come up in conversation and that have questions that have come in about where those gaps that the guidelines quite don't inform around. And I suspect we can talk about, how might this be operationalized? What are some of the issues that you may already be experiencing as competency committee chairs that you want to share? So just to bring us here to the distinction that the college is brought between the competency committee responsibilities and the residency program, we've really looked at and discussed a lot the process of ratification. Currently, as you would know, the competency committee is required to make their decisions for resident status review as well as progression decisions, and to share that recommendation to the RPC for ratification. And in our present guidelines and in our documents that have been shared out centrally, we've communicated around recommendations and best practices to have that done within a respective time of the competency committee review meeting. To my knowledge, programs have typically arranged a separate ratification meeting within 7 to 10 days of that CC meeting, and then trying within 2 weeks or so, or a more reasonable time frame, to get that decision making back out to the resident via letter. We know that there's variability across competency committees. That's part of Ronald's work in the evaluation of it. But the big change here to note is that the college has terminated the necessity of a ratification process. We issued a statement, Parveen and I, this week to clarify around that. So this table really illustrates kind of what the competency committee is required to do, what their main tasks are, and that does include continuing to make those decisions and determine the resident status, and to communicate those outcomes to the RPC, but nothing is indicating that it needs to be formally ratified. The RPC has always had an evaluation and quality improvement requirement or mandate, and it is outlined here in terms of that process. So creating and managing the processes by which the resident assessment occurs, including the appeal processes, and ensuring those processes are followed, and then being aware and accountable to those CC outcomes. So what we've done to date and the whole process around issuing the competency committee checklist was to, one, bring a tool into process whereby the competency committee can communicate their outcomes. It's an aggregate, so the number of residents that are progressing as expected, not progressing as expected, failing to progress, any challenges, and etc. And that we collected that data from programs and competency committee chairs, PDs, to take a look at how that process is happening and what's working and not working. So Parveen, I was going to have you kind of come in here to talk about, now that that ratification process is gone and the challenges may be brought forward to the RPC, and the RPC now can function as a level 1 appeal committee. Did you want to speak now to this point about what that means for changing?
Sure. I think one of the reasons why this came up, well, 2 reasons. Number one, just logistically, it was really hard for competence committees and RPCs to be kind of closely linked together in terms of timing and the delay that happened in getting information out to the programs. Number 2, I think it was just so, it didn't seem to really make a lot of sense. The competence committee really spent a lot of time, and then for the RPC to make the decision with little or no primary data. And then the third reason was the appeal committee. So we have, for our appeals, one of the tenets of appeals is that the committee that makes a decision can't hear the appeal regarding the decision. It should make sense. And so then we had a whole bunch of small programs having to have several different committees. I think, you know what, I think, so what we said is that your RPC, unless your RPC has made the decision, like let's say it was a remediation decision that your RPC made, you guys can decide how you want to manage that, is that the RPC can become your appeals committee. So it makes it a bit easier. I think several programs have moved towards a departmental appeal process, which I think is great and kind of gets rid of the kind of the small program conflict of interest issues. But if people didn't have an appeal, a level 1 appeals committee, they can use the RPC using the directions that we have in our appeals document. So that just makes it a bit easier. That's it.
Any questions?
Anybody have any questions about that? Yeah, Lee.
Yeah, Parveen, thank you for the explanation. Just about this new Royal College thing about ratification doesn't happen at RPC. Does it mean that CC decision on the status of the resident is not being questioned by RPC?
No, it can be questioned if you can do what you like, Ellie, but there's no automatic ratification process that is required by the Residency Program Committee. So the Residency Program Committee essentially delegates the responsibility of the decisions regarding assessment based on a systematic review of the assessment tools that have been used, and delegates what the RPC wants to do. The RPC will be a QI committee to say, okay, are the decisions that are being made by the Competence Committee valid? And that means having the Competence Committee review the processes by which they make the decisions, not so much individual decisions, but how are they making decisions in general? Number two, what are they doing with situations with incomplete data? Are they standardizing it? So in terms of the decision-making process, that needs to be actually, if you will, ratified by the RPC, but not the individual decisions by the CC. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And again, I don't want to ask and relate everything to accreditation, but that would be a big part in pain residency that we are working on. So already we are doing this decision making in CC committee, and we report this decision to the RPC. And before that, we were giving this report, again, as you said, like 1 or 2 weeks ahead of time. Does that mean that we can have a part of RPC meeting can be CC meeting, and we can just have our conclusion about the resident status because we already had access to all those assessments and EPAs, and just before RPC, we come with the decision, and like in first 20 minutes of RPC, we can have our CC, and then people can join and we can give them decision. Do I make sense, kind of?
Yeah, you don't need to time it with the RPC, because you don't really need to you don't really need to tell the RPC decisions right away. Does it need to be timed? You can time your competence committee any way you want to. So for example, sometimes assessment committees can follow division meetings because all the division members are there for the division meeting, so that they can say, so you can certainly time it for convenience, for sure. That's not a problem.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions? Parveen, if somebody was looking for policy or guidance on the appeals process, or any other kind of challenge, where would you direct them?
The appeals, I would actually just go to your appeals policy. The appeals policy that we have for learners are for residents, and it goes through what the appeal process is. Number one, it goes through what can be appealed. Not everything can be appealed. Like, for example, an enhanced education program can't be appealed. That's meant to be a bit of a formative tool. An unsatisfactory IDER can only be appealed at the program level, and then you can't. If it's not successful, the learner can't appeal it at level 2, level 3. All of those are outlined in the appeals policy. There is also a template in the appeals policy as an appendix that has the PGY1, not PGY, but a level 1 appeals template, that what the process looks like. So the appeals policy is really the process by which appeals are. It gives you the timelines for learners. Learners should all be aware of the appeals policy. Sometimes they don't really know because they haven't had to appeal it, but whenever you have a decision that is appealable, it is always good practice to ensure that the learner knows that it can be appealed and where to find the appeal policy. Does anybody have specific questions about the appeal process? Because it's all kind of codified in policy.
So can we find it on the CBME website then, this appeals policy document?
Yeah, so I think what we'll do, Britta, because it's a really good question, is that we should send, and we had wanted to do this, is it really important to send the assessment, PGME assessment guidelines, the assessment grid, and the appeals policy to all competence committee chairs, because you really need to know when you're making decisions what are the guidelines for these decisions. There's a PGME grid which looks at what's the difference between an enhanced educational program, remediation, probation. And so, you can kind of see that, and then the appeal. So I think it's really important information for competence committee chairs to get that, and members. So we'll send it to you as chairs, and then you guys can forward it to your members, because it's really important to use the policy document that we have when making decisions. Obviously, you'll have internal ones, but when it comes to making modified educational plans for recommendations and appeals, it's the post-grad policy that we follow, that we ask people to follow. So we'll send that to you. It's available on the McMaster post-grad website. So if you do McMaster University PGME, it'll come up, and under train, it'll be policies, and all of the policies of post-grad medical education are there. But I think it's easier, so we'll just send it to you, and you have it, and you can send it to your committee members.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Sometimes there's good redundancy, so we also upload CBD relevant policy or guidelines to our to the CBME website as well. And there's a drop down under resources called guidelines and policies. So we'll make sure it's there as well. One of the things that came out of the CCFL working group meeting today, which has kind of been in process, was how can we pull together all of this relevant information? There's a lot of resources, Royal College site, CBME site, some of which are getting updated, like the terms of reference just did. So we had one guideline document that we had produced at the PG level called Everything You Needed to Know About Competency Committees, and that we were going to update that. With these guidelines pending and what came out of the meeting this morning, we decided, can we make like a guideline document that's brand new, that has templates appended, that has policies appended, or links to them, and we put everything kind of housed in one place. And so that's an objective. One of the faculty development objectives was to orient competency committee chairs as they're incoming to CBD. So Ellie, that's something I'll make sure that you absolutely have access to. Okay, any other questions relating to the CC and RPC relationship? Ronald, I'm trying to think of some of the things that came out of this morning. Really kind of had to do with the hows. So one thing that might be worth speaking a little bit more about is the use of the competency committee checklist. So one of the things that was required was some sort of method or tool for the competency committee to relay their outcomes to the RPC. And the CC checklist was developed initially for an evaluation tool to help us understand how CCs are doing, elucidate what best practices and recommendations, what are the issues. That tool, Parveen, if you wanted to speak to, we talked about using that tool, and it was mentioned in the outgoing statement that that tool should be, it's recommended, or maybe it's mandatory, that that tool is used for a CC to communicate their outcomes to RPC to help them keep informed. Is that done on an annual basis? Will that continue to be by July 1? If RPCs are having to oversee and pay close attention to the CC decisions and capturing residents that may not be progressing as expected, should it be more frequent than just the end of the, like in June? Can we talk about that a little bit? That's come up in questions.
From my perspective, it is not so much an evaluation tool. I wouldn't call it that. It's a quality improvement tool. And we're not really kind of in a position to evaluate the competence committees in perspective of postgrad. Our hope is that it's a quality improvement tool so that we would have you guys fill that out. The reason for using the tool, originally Ronald had developed the tool with Lisa to kind of say, because we really wanted a way to actually see what was happening for our own institutional QI, because one of the things that's going to be happening in standards, accreditation institutional standards, is direct oversight of the postgrad office on competence committee. So we thought that we'd get a head start before the accreditation standard actually came out, and so that we would use it as a way to say, this is how we do kind of like a QI. But then there's no point in using one tool for us and then another tool for yourself. So it was really a suggestion that if you wanted to use this tool, this really captures the information that I think is important for your RPC. And then once you do it, then you just send it along to us. And that's it. Then it's like and it was always kind of meant to be that, is that you would use this tool to help with your feedback to the RPC, and then the completed tool would just come back to us for our institutional processes. How you want to do it, once a year, twice a year, I think, again, we don't want to actually be dictating that. I think what you want to think about is how often does the competency committee meet? And is it a small program, large program, medium-sized program? And this is probably a decision that I think we should mandate, but that you guys should decide from the person. We just want it once a year, but if you need to do it before then, you would decide with your RPC, your residency program committee, how often would this be useful for the RPC, recognizing the RPC will no longer need to ratify decisions.
Ronald, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so just a couple of points of clarification. So yeah, this was never intended to be an evaluation tool. It's really all about understanding how the competence committees are working. And so for the RPC, it's a way of just providing a quick summary report of what activity has happened in the competence committee from the last time they saw a report until this report. There are other ways that information could be conveyed, but it also happens to be information that we want to collect at postgrad as well. And so we tried to design this in a way that it could double up as a mechanism for just sharing information, but it is not the tool that the competence committee will use to share their outcomes of each meeting with the RPC, just to be clear. That will happen separately. This is like just an overview of activity that allows the RPC a window into what has the competence committee been up to. And as the ratification process moves away and out of the hands of the RPC, I think the way that information flows between the competence committees and the RPC will evolve over time. But yeah, just to be clear what this isn't, it's not an evaluation tool, and it's not a mechanism for sending individual meeting outcomes to the RPC. It is a summary of activity that is useful for both postgrad and hopefully for the RPC as well. just to allow everyone to understand what the competence committee's been up to and what's working well, and if there are any kind of pain points or any things that are happening, as a way of flagging it, just to say, hey, here's something that we might want to pay attention to. That was all.
Thanks, Ronald. Great clarification. Did anybody on the call want to share any suggestions? I know Ellie's coming up to transition in July in terms of that process that seems to have worked well for you. Getting that information to RPC.
Sorry, what's the question, Lisa?
If anybody wanted to share the process that they use currently for communicating the CC recommendations to the RPC. What have you found is most efficient and seems to work well?
What we typically do for surgical foundations is we time our competency committee meetings to be preceding our RPC meetings, usually by a couple of weeks, so that by the time of the RPC meeting, we have all of the decisions and recommendations made by the competency committee. And then I, as the chair, present it to the RPC. And that's what we do. We kind of list kind of a general trends. We go through, areas that seem to be problem points for the residents. We do a little comparison of how this year's residents are doing compared to the previous years or the previous cohort. And then we go through, who's being promoted, who's not, and then we distribute and review all of the letters so that they can be ratified, which I guess we will not be doing anymore.
Right.
Yeah, and I just want to make it clear is that the process that you have works for you, and that's what you'd really like. And the RPC actually wants to know the decisions. It's totally okay. It's not. This isn't. It really is that some programs just found it a useless process just to go through every single resident, especially in large programs. But Laura, what you sound like, what sounds like you're doing is actually really excellent. It's a bit of a quality improvement followed by a list of residents. So you'd still continue with the first part and then get rid of the list of residents. That's all you would get rid of, is that. And some RPCs may want to say, you know what, we're happy for you to give us a list of all decisions with progressing as expected, but actually we want to review the not progressing as expected or failure to progress, and we want to make the decisions on those. Right. And the only thing is that you can no longer be the appeals committee, but that's okay. That's not the end of the world if you have another way to do the appeals. Right. So, I think it's meant, part of this process is to ensure that it's flexible for people's programs and people's situations and see what works for you. And again, just go through all of this with your RPC to say, okay, what do we want to see out of this? And what's helpful to us as a committee. But I think comparing is actually really, is really nice to be able to compare cohort, because for that's actually good that you're able to do that actually.
So this came up for a discussion in today's group meeting, was where people store the documents, assessments that collectively provide the evidence the Royal College may look to, so that the competency committee can defend their decisions. And that was there was an area of variability there. Some might warrant discussion here. Some use Dropbox as a large file sharing. Others use share them right to like internally servers. And then we have developed the competency committee review dashboard, which is actually a document repository. And I've done quite a bit in promotion of that since we launched it in December 2020. There's been quite a bit of uptake, and program administrators as a super user have really liked it and are promoting it, making the prep for a competency committee a lot more efficient, and they've gone as far to use the CC review dashboard as a file holding single central location for all resident documents. And so that's one I can suggest to you, Ellie. I'm not sure what others on the call have found helpful, but there's been a lot of focus on how to most efficiently pull out data from MedSys to inform the decision-making process. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I just wanted to kind of profile the CC review dashboard. Val, I see your hands up.
Yeah, we switched to the review dashboard when it became available, and we love it. So easy to store everything there. Like everybody that needs to complete a form or get to information is all there in one place. So we have really found it very, very helpful.
Excellent. There's also some, the security privacy issue too, and that it's stored within MedSys and not in kind of external programs. So that's another nice plus.
Just Lisa, I just want to interrupt there because I was the one that brought up Dropbox at the working group. So, I mean, Diane re-talked to me afterwards. Apparently, I mean, I'm pretty new for a CC chair here. So apparently we had an external review and they apparently were okay with Dropbox. But I mean, I understand the security kind of reasoning behind moving away from Dropbox. But just to add that, Diane Reed apparently said they did go through this with an external reviewer. Apparently it was okay, but.
Yeah. Oh, that's good to share, Michael, because that had come up before in other questions. I think the other plus that you might, I know you're going to, Cheyenne's actually on the call. You're actually seeing her there. We mentioned her earlier in terms of having her orient you to the CC review dashboard to check it out. But one of the things that was the plus too was being able to create those folders and organize the documents somewhat more than in a list or so. Okay, thank you for that, Michael. The other thing that kind of came up was the types of information or data that would inform competency committee decision-making and the entire primary review process, and how we can, consider even larger groups with a larger number of residents to be able to get the data that's needed right at the fingertips. And so one of the things that we do promote is the learner summary report, which can be pulled from MedSys at any time. It can be date ranged, so you can pull from the date of the last competency committee to current, or from last academic coach meeting to current as they prepare for the competency committee. That document rolls up all EPAs, milestones, ITERs, narrative, and all CBD forms into one document. And so that's been something that's promoted. Are people finding that helpful? Do you use it? Is there another way that you've found useful for that purpose? And we're going to talk about the exports next. I guess I'm speaking around the issue primary reviewers might have with reviewing all of the data on a resident to be able to present them at the competency committee. And we have responded to that challenge because we have seen that it's been a bit difficult to pull data out of MedSys fairly efficiently. And so we've done two things. One, we have, you have the learner summary. The other is the exports that can be generated from MedSys. One is a large program export, which attached to your documents today is a whole list that Cheyenne prepared, of which is in each export. Actually, Cheyenne, did you just want to speak to that real quick? There's two exports.
Sure. So the first one that Lisa just touched on is a full EPA export. And what this does is it provides a large Excel document. So it can be a little bit intimidating when you first receive it. So if you're not overly familiar with like hiding columns or using pivot tables or anything like that, it is a little bit scary. I'll be entirely honest, but it does provide quite a bit of information, and that include like the learner's full name, learning path, their current stage of training, the start of the stage, and the end of each stage. It can include all of their EPAs and their EPA scores, including any contextual variables and any milestones if programs are looking at milestones. There are some limitations at this point, unfortunately, as it doesn't include any of the rotation names, and it doesn't include any qualitative comments or the observer name, so the person that actually completed the assessment. But those fields we have an expanded export change request within MedSys, so that's something that we're hoping to obtain in the future. So that will be helpful. I would say, in addition to the learner summary report, which is a great resource, this would actually put at least all of your trainees in one large Excel document, as opposed to having a single learner summary report for each trainee. And then again, if you're Excel savvy, you can manipulate the data any way that you'd like to make it more useful for you. Another export that we have, program administrators or anybody with, you guys probably could actually do this too in MedSys, but typically program administrators are probably quite familiar with it, is the evaluation schedule export. And what that does is it takes filters from the evaluation schedule, and it just kind of puts everything, again, it dumps it into Excel, but it doesn't have any qualitative data or any EPA forms, like information on individual forms. But it does give you a good idea of, I think a very useful thing would be for trainees that are have a bunch of forms triggered, but you're not able to tell if the forms have been completed or expired, because a lot of times you can't see that on the dashboard currently. So this would be able to give you a status for each of the forms that have been triggered, and then you can maybe even pinpoint to see if there's specific supervisors that are letting forms expire more frequently than others. I don't have any actual examples to show you. I'm just kind of briefly going over my summary that they have attached to the calendar, but that's the high-level overview of the two different exports.
Thanks, Cheyenne.
No problem.
And actually, just to mention, Cheyenne has just scheduled all of her training sessions throughout March, early April. She's doing quite a bit of training or 2 training sessions on the CC review dashboard, open to all, and a special session that we do winter and spring with Dr. Eileen Yang, which is EPA assessment in MedSys. And Dr. Yang covers the rationale as well as how to trigger as a faculty from a faculty perspective. And it's all done within the system. And then Cheyenne carries on with a demo of the resident dashboard and the CC review dashboard. So that's a great session that's coming up on March 27th. That's all, Ellie, I would suggest for an incoming that you might want to really promote attendance with your faculty and CC chair. It's been quite helpful and well received. So the other thing that we've done, or sorry, any questions with, we discussed quite a bit there. Any just real quick questions about things you've just heard? Okay, the other I was gonna share was Cheyenne concurred that we are expanding the export, the data fields on the export to help with monitoring scores and identifying faculty and expiries and all of that. That's happening. But we're also adding a significant change to the current resident dashboard with an incoming data visualization dashboard based on Brent Thoma's work you may be familiar with out of Saskatchewan. And we have that functional design completed. It's off to the developers. There was a large working group, 20 member working group with all their different key roles that gave input into that with Chantal Campbell from MedSys. And we're excited about that. We're anticipating it hopefully for fall that we'll have the prototype, if not something that we can actually work with from the dashboard. That's going to solve some of the problems that we've heard about in terms of having to do the digging down to understand progress on contextual variables, to look at the different CBD forms and get a sense of the EPA scores. So benefit there is it will be quite well graphically displayed. The contextual variables will be on the dashboard. The EPAs are mapped across rotations, and there's the opportunity to click for more information on different parts of the dashboard. The other thing that has been dropped is the progress bar, because we've shifted it to a different type of visual display. So residents will still be able to view their progress, but the progress bar and the complications of it, and the frustrations for residents in terms of it actually moving is going to be gone, because it's not going to remain on the dashboard. And the residents were quite thrilled about that, because it was really set to the recommended number, and that the college recommends in terms of observations, and some may not need that recommended number and actually progressed before actually completing that recommended number. And with that dashboard being set, or that progress bar being set to that, they might progress or be progressed at 85%. And it was frustrating them that it wasn't ever getting to 100%. And they couldn't really quite tell where they were at. So that's really good news. And that will be a help to competency committees too. Actually, a question there. I know some competency committees and PAs use the resident dashboard during a meeting to view. Anybody on the call do that, or do they have feedback about how this data visualization dashboard would be much more useful for rapid viewing of data and decision making?
We use the resident dashboard during our meetings.
Is it helpful, or
It is.
yeah. Okay.
I don't think we necessarily use the visualization portion of it and the percentages and the colors, but we do go through it.
Yeah, we do the same. We don't put much weight on the percentages, because I think, especially in our specialty, some of the percentages are obviously not accurate, because it's impossible to calculate, because, for example, you need 1 out of 4 and then one has to peep anyway. So they're not necessarily all accurate, but especially for some of the more questionable EPAs, we open it up during the meeting. We actually read through some of the EPAs that are done specifically looking at the comments. So we find that it's helpful to have it all open. So
Great. One of the things that was mentioned, I reached out to PDs, PAs, and CC chairs to collect information on what they find are the key challenges with implementation. This is an ongoing kind of effort with the college around suggesting what adaptations to the model might result in a better experience for residents and faculty and everyone, and better outcomes. And one of the comments was the feeling that there's a lack of congruence between the scores and the EPA scores as they come in with what actually is in the narrative or the understanding of the resident's performance in clinically and otherwise. Is anybody experiencing that in terms of O scores and narrative on the CBD forms and what's actually coming in discussion at a competency committee? And do you satisfy it somehow else with other information assessment data?
It does sometimes come up, but usually for surgical foundations, it's more in the context of a resident who hasn't triggered enough EPAs, and they are felt to be a strong resident who's conscientious and is gaining these competencies, but is just not documenting it well. So the way that we reconcile that is that we tell them to trigger more EPAs and we review them again.
Good. Thanks, Laura. Did anybody else want to raise anything else for discussion? They haven't been out long, but the new terms of reference are there. But there is, outside of the ratification change, quite a bit has stayed the same. Is there other issues that you're facing as a competency committee chair that might be rectified somehow at a PG level or?
So right now for us, so we're a small program. So I know I haven't met everyone. So I'm the otolaryngology CC chair. So our terms of reference says that on our committee, there should be a otolaryngology representative. So we just lost our plastic surgery representative, and we're having a little bit of difficulty trying to find someone to replace him on the committee. So I don't know if the PGME level has any advice or resources for us to do that, because we're basically running just on quorum with the program director and then Diane Reed. So we're just trying to find someone. So we're having a little bit of difficulty doing that.
Parveen, I don't know if you concur that from my understanding to date, if you find a faculty from a similar program that would have some level of competency in the assessment and discipline specific competencies, that you can invite somebody external.
Yeah, I don't know, Mike, if the question is number one, do you need to have that, or number two, you like to have that and you just can't find anybody? I think it's the latter, right?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of inherited those terms. So I think, I don't know if that's an expectation to have a non-service representative. So I inherited that kind of, that criteria from our terms. But it's more probably the second question for me, at least.
Yeah, you know what? I think it's nice I think it's actually good to have someone from outside the specialty as well. And it's, as Lisa said, maybe in a surgical specialty, because it actually has a little bit of a different nuance than medical specialties, but there's not a requirement to be able to do that. So if you need one because you need an extra person, it can be within your specialty if you can find somebody, but it's not a requirement from an accreditation perspective. No.
I do know some programs that were smaller were bringing in an external to help mitigate against bias. So there has been some trend to have an external. Mike, did that answer your question? Is there?
Yeah, I mean, I also remember renewal is actually on our CC as well, but yeah, no, that's helpful, because then if we were having difficulty, then I don't necessarily have to really try to find someone outside if that's not an expectation from a PGME level.
No, it's up to you guys to be able to kind of do it as long as the committee is working and stuff. So one of the one of our kind of goals over the next couple of years is really to have a really kind of strategic, systematic EDI lens on all of our activities and processes and procedures within PGME. So, the first thing we're doing is we're looking at our policies, and the first policy that's been really updated to looking at that is program director selection policy, in which all of the members of the program director selection committee is mandated to do unconscious bias training, for whatever that may be worth. But it's and also to look at the committee structure with an EDI lens. Obviously, it's difficult when you can't find people to be on the committee to start kind of looking at that. But I think, our next step is to really look at our assessment and look at it systematically and ensure that people are viewing, can we give training, for example, to competency committee members about bias, about unconscious bias, about diversity of the committee. And this goes for all of our committees, our residency program committee, our postgrad committees. So over the next year or so is really to kind of year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but really try and make a deliberate attempt not to have EDI as a solo event, like you have an EDI committee, but really to have it as part of every single committee's agenda. Is how can we look at equity, diversity, inclusion? There's a lot of information about differential ascertainment bias and in terms of assessments for racialized learners. There is going to be you may already know about it, but there is a post-grad workshop that's being run by Heather Waters, EAB, Suzanne Archie, who's our PGME EDI chair, specifically to look at assessment and the impact of discrimination. Or unconscious discrimination, whatever, if that's a term, in terms of assessment. And I think we did send it out. What I heard was we had sent it out to competence committee chairs. Lisa, is that or it's on May 27th?
Sorry, I missed what you were referring to.
The EAB workshop on assessment. Diversity and discrimination for assessment decisions. I think it's on March 27th. My understanding from Suzanne this morning was that CC chairs were invited, but did you guys get that information? I think it's online.
I think it might be on the PG side. I can look it up and drop it in the chat.
Yeah, so I think what we can do is Naz, can you please liaise with Allison? And because she's actually part of the EAB, and just see, did we actually send this out to CC chairs as well as the program directors? I think it might be valuable for those of you who have time to actually kind of view this, to kind of come to this workshop. So kind of the next steps for us in postgrad is to just to be a little bit more systematic in our approaches of how to ensure that EDI principles are kind of throughout our postgrad activities, as opposed to just being a committee that we currently have. So our next step would actually really be competence committees, and also our residency program committees. I don't know if anybody had any thoughts about that. If anybody is interested in that, we'd love to have you participate in any of our activities. Just let me know. But that would be kind of next. So we'll forward that information to you. If anybody can make it, that'd be great. I think it is virtual, but I'm not actually 100% sure about that.
Sorry, Pervin, is it kind of the same one that recently you guys had it for us in a yacht club?
Yeah, it's very similar to that, but it's actually being run by our educational advisory board, but very similar principles, Ellie.
Quite huge. Very good one.
Okay.
Since we were talking about committee membership, any discussion around having residents participate? That's come up. Oh, sorry. Did you have a question? No. Any questions around having residents participate? Pros and cons. That's come up quite a bit. Anybody find it useful, and process around it? Are they used during decision making?
Naz, could you just mute for us? That'd be great.
I did notice in the terms of reference that were just published that the recommendation is that, let's see if I can find it real quick. Oh, in order to share the new document, I have to stop and share again. Let me just refer to it while it's on my screen. Terms of membership. It did specify, I'm going to stop sharing and share again. I'm going to bring this up. 1 second here.
Hello? Hi.
Okay, so let's just see if I can. It really, it's not jumping out. It really had to do with the competency of the members in terms of having assessment and skills and so on. And it kind of brought into question, you know, who would be chosen as members? Does this in any way relate to the idea of having residents participate? Do they have to have a particular skill set, or a senior resident that would have more experience if they've been supervising? Any thoughts around that? It's often kind of just discussed briefly and not very fulsomely, and I'm curious about that. It does come to into questions. Thanks, Laura.
So we have residents on the cardiac surgery competence committee, and it's actually been incredibly helpful, both in terms of understanding the context where some things maybe aren't really as they appear from the data, but also in terms of then helping the residents understand how the competence committee works and giving them some confidence that actually the committee is making well-reasoned, carefully thought out decisions. And so we're finding that having the residents as part of that has really instilled a lot more confidence in the rest of the residents, because the residents report back on the things that they're allowed to and kind of can then explain the process a little bit more clearly. It's also helping to get more buy-in. And it also does help the conversation at the competence committee stay more focused on the data and move less out into anecdotes, and so stay more appropriate. So far we found it to be kind of a win-win all around, has been my experience.
Val.
No, I just had a question for Ronald. I'm wondering if the decision to have residents on the committee was sort of a decision that maybe the RTC made, or was it the competence committee that made that decision, or i.e., were residents involved in the decision of whether or not residents should be on the committee?
So initially it was the competence committee that decided that resident perspective would be useful. And then the competence committee made the suggestion to the RPC that it be something that they considered, and then the residents got involved and everybody decided it was a good idea.
So if in programs where the learner could be identified, does it, I think in larger programs it can be a senior resident, and if it's a junior resident being reviewed, then there's less potential perceived conflict of interest, if there is at all. Are residents particularly excused if it's in a small program and the learner can be identified? Are there privacy and confidentiality issues there? These are some of the questions that come up.
So cardiac is a small program, and no, I mean, essentially we consider this to be part of training them for when they're going to have to be a faculty member and will have to do evaluations on people. And so, there's some training for them in confidentiality and also in kind of how to manage these kind of conversations and the information that's flowed, but they fully participate, they just don't vote.
Okay, no issues to date where the learner has issues with a colleague in the meeting, like it hasn't.
No, so the residents had a hand in selecting which residents actually were sat on the committee, and they did so knowing that they would be part of these conversations. So there's buy-in right the way through it.
Okay, thank you, Ronald. Very helpful.
I think it's a great question, though, Val, because we have found that that residents have not wanted it. So I think it's really important that, as Ronald said, that there's buy-in from the residents. The other thing, if you want to have a resident voice, and for all the reasons that Ronald has mentioned, is whether there's cross-pollination from other programs, to have, like Michael was talking about, another program person faculty, but you could potentially get a resident from another program. Val, for OB-GYN, it could be your subspecialty resident that sits on that. I think having the resident perspective in terms of preventing hearsay, and I work with this one, is that actually is really powerful. Actually, it does. I do really think that it will cause people to curtail to the evidence at hand. But if residents were really worried about their colleague that they're going to be on call with tonight, knowing all of their kind of assessment decisions, that a resident from another program. And it's actually a great learning experience for the resident, as Rano said, really great to be able to look at how assessments. So even if there was different residents on different committees, like even within the surgical department, I think that would be really, for Ellie, for pain medicine, it could be an anesthesia resident. That could be a senior anesthesia resident that could be on your committee. And that takes away a little bit about the stress for the residents of their colleagues hearing about their performance, because it is a bit tricky for residents.
It is, and it really does require resident consent and resident buy-in. So this only works in cardiac because all the residents really want this. And I think if any of them didn't, then we'd have to approach it differently.
And the other thing we've always recommend is that you reassess the decision at the beginning of each academic year, because remember, there's going to be new residents starting, so not everybody's going to feel the same. So is that it's a decision that's made annually, that there'll be decisions at the competence committee level, that there'll be residents there.
I think Ellie had her hand up.
Yeah, team, do you give any incentive to the residents who want to be included on the CC committee? Just because it's going to be meetings, I want to see if you're giving any incentive, or it's just their preference, or they are volunteered for that.
I doubt if cardiac surgery is doing it. I'm not sure, Rano, but we don't usually, Ellie, for these kind of committee roles, because it's also part of their leadership development. It's probably not surprising. It shouldn't be surprising, but residents are actually committed to a lot of this, and you'd get a lot of. Also, they get to also put it on their CV. And sometimes people have made it. If you're going to have a different resident from another committee, to kind of make it, we are trying to make it a little bit of what's the word? Kind of a, we're looking for residents that have the experience and expertise you're going to get. So you can frame it in a way that it really is a learning and also prestige position for them.
Yeah, super. And Parveen, Lisa, do you have any thoughts about involving fellows who are mostly like international medical graduates, and they come for 1 or 2 years? Do you think there is a role for them to be on this committees? I'm just trying to address the problem of having less human resources for our CC in small programs. I mean, do you think we can involve them? Do you think it's a good idea? For all reasons that you talked about?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ellie. I don't, I'd love to turn it over to others. I'm not. I think it depends on the fellow, and it really depends on the ability of the fellow, etc. So I don't see anything wrong with it in any way, shape, or form. I think it's definitely no guidelines to say that can't be. So if you have the right person, absolutely. I don't see any kind of downs to it. I don't know if anybody else. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Just a quick question from that. If the resident is a participant, can we consider quorum based on a resident member? Or does quorum have to be achieved with faculty membership, and a resident is a nice add-on?
Quorum has to be voting members.
Yeah.
So that's a consideration as you're trying to find ways to populate. Okay.
Yeah, I would strongly caution against adding residents for the sake of making quorum.
Right.
Yeah.
That was kind of the point at the end. Yeah, thank you. That's come up. The other, and Dave Callum was going to come. He's our CBME chair for learner development. And he's done quite a bit of work in trying to orient residents to the competency committee to have them understand really what happens. And, you know, having residents participate is a great option for residents to share with others exactly what's going on. Is there thoughts around how to further promote that, to strengthen that relationship between resident and competency committee? Some of the things I have heard is residents don't feel they have access to the competency committee or can approach the competency committee in any way. I'm not sure that that's true, but it's a perception. Others are sometimes unsure of what the competency committee does. They're not involved in the reviews, and then they get their letter and they may not understand why it's, you know, not progressing as expected, simply because they're behind in some EPAs and they get a not progressing as expected, which could change before the next meeting. It's obviously articulated in the letter, but something, how to promote maybe more of that comfort and relationship outside of just, you know, sending that letter or an EAP or a learning plan. Something that I do know some PDs meet with their resident if they are not progressing as expected, and they set learning goals and they update the learning plan, and the flow comes out of the meeting to best meet the residents' needs and get them back on track, and that conversation. Is there more to discuss here around how to help residents better understand the competency committee? What have you done in your own programs that has seemed to be really well received? Or is this an issue at all that you've identified?
Well, I think in our program, that's where the academic coaches are pretty important. So when they first start, then usually the academic coaches kind of give an overview. And I think it'll be a little bit easier now because I think the medical students have started on CBD. So I think those are going to be a better segue, but at least in our program, the academic coaches are pretty important, especially in the first couple of years in keeping people on track. And then obviously in our program, because we've done CBD for at least 5-6 years now, the junior residents have kind of the intermediate and senior residents to have some guidance too. So we haven't had an issue, but that's because we've kind of been a little bit more established, but I think the academic coaches play a big role in that.
That's great. Speaking to academic coaches, there's been kind of two sides of the fences, whether the academic coach serves the primary reviewer role well. It has been promoted at the college level in workshops that I've attended in terms of them being able to take the committee potentially a view beyond the numbers in understanding the resident. But they would be non-voting or part of that deliberation. But they do bring forward a really good sense of the resident. Any thoughts on that? I hear both.
So obviously in PAIN program, we are not on CBD yet. And what we were doing in the last year, we kind of started to practice having CC. That's why I was involved to be ready for this transition. But as Mike said, like academic advisor or coach is the most important person as a first reviewer. And then we assign second reviewer as a separate person to have another set of eyes and quite independently to assess all the GDEs, like global daily evals, just because we don't have EPAs yet. I'm thinking if you don't use academic advisor as a voter, then how many people you need to assess, you know? So again, specifically, I'm talking about small programs such as us, 1 or 2 residents maximum, and very limited number of faculties involved in academic.
Thoughts from others?
I mean, our faculty numbers are pretty low. So I mean, we have 14 faculty. So I know Renewal, as I said, is part of our CC. So our quorum is, I think, 4. So obviously, if you have even less than we do, then I think it'll just be a challenge. I think it depends on your terms of reference, but I think that's why you do need, I think, faculty buy-in. Where I came from, I trained in Toronto and as a fellow as part of the Competence Committee, and obviously in Toronto, our faculty list was like 40 to 50, and so there was no issue there. But I think with a smaller program, you just have to have faculty buy-in if you're going to be part of CBD. So
Thank you. Any comment with respect to the secondary reviewing process? Some of the competency committees I was able to attend had the primary reviewer present with great assistance from the PA in terms of preparing that. And then the entire rest of the committee served as secondary reviewers and together completed the deliberation. Is that something that's commonly practiced? Is your experience? I'm just wondering about the weight of the review process on 2 individuals versus one primary reviewer, and then the rest kind of listen to the primary reviewer and engage in the deliberation. Val?
We have the academic coach act as the primary reviewer, and then a competence committee member will thoroughly review the resident's file and then present that to the competence committee, who will then discuss and make a decision.
And does that work okay for numbers in your program to be able to divide up the number of residents? I'm just thinking, well, you have, I didn't write down your number, but
we have around 40. So each, which is about, well, it's around 7 per year, give or take. A few extra here and there. And so most of the time, each competence committee member is just reviewing one resident, reviewing them and then presenting one resident at a time. Sometimes I pick up the extra resident just to help out.
Yeah, that's good. I've heard also that I don't, maybe 4 weeks prior to review, academic coaches find that is a good time to actually meet with the resident, pull the learner summary if they do, and start to prepare for that. Maybe 3 weeks prior. Is that typical too in terms of a recommendation to help that, to kind of schedule that so that they have enough time and the resident can...
So that's what we do. So 4 weeks before, so for example, I'm meeting in mid-March, so we sent out an email asking for academic coaches to meet with the residents, and we actually have a report that the academic coaches fill out. So that's not just the EPAs and difference from the last resident review, but also any in-training scores or any exam scores, any new research projects. And then we keep track of their work-based assessment. So then that all kind of gets reported. So as I said earlier, we have their EPA dashboard up, and then we also share a screen of the report that they filled out. So it just makes it a little bit more streamlined. And then in a small program like ours, basically the academic coach is the primary reviewer. I'm kind of like a 1.5 reviewer where I kind of try to go through everyone, and then the rest of the committee are the secondary reviewers. So I found that works well. We've kept our meetings to within usually 2.5 to 3 hours usually. So
It's helpful. Thank you, Michael. Just conscious of time. We have about 12 minutes. Did anybody have any things to table for discussion? The other thing that is welcome, if you have particular recommendations for adaptations to the model that relate to you as a CC chair. So the college is receiving recommendations about what they might change to make it better, make it a better experience for residents, more feasible, manageable, and meeting what the intentions were. Any comments? What would you change if you could, kind of thing? Val?
Would it be okay if I asked a question?
Of course, yeah.
I was just wondering how, and maybe some of you don't know yet because you're just starting out. But I was wondering how people are logistically handling the move away from required numbers, which I think everybody agrees is great. That we're not, going for 10 or whatever observations on certain EPAs, but logistically, like when you're actually in a meeting trying to make sure that you're being fair and consistent across residents, I was wondering how people are handling that. What we decided to do was to still sort of keep those numbers in mind and just sort of expect that as we were before for each stage. But when we got to sort of critical decision-making times, if somebody was missing one something here and in the scheme of things looked otherwise competent, then we would make a decision about whether it was okay to, go for fewer than the previously expected number.
Yeah, so just to clarify, the recommended number of observations is simply that, recommended by the college. The contextual variables are an absolute. And you're speaking to the recommended number of observations, right, Val?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. Anybody?
Well, I think for us, I mean, it depends on the specific EPA. Like, for example, for us, let's just throw out an example. If a tracheostomy number was on the cusp, we know that at least in our specialty, residents have lots of exposure to trachs, and so the expectation would be you should be able to complete the recommended number. So I think there's just more for the more difficult EPAs where we go by case discussion and about those specific EPAs that might be harder to get. So I think for us, it's EPA dependent. So we would probably not advance a resident who did not meet the required recommended observations for a tracheostomy, but for something rare like a diverticulum, I think it'd be a case-by-case basis. So that's kind of how we've been doing it. I think it depends on the EPA that is in question.
And sorry, Val, I want to share something with you too in anesthesia world that I'm working there as an academic coach. What we do, as you said, we try to reach the recommended numbers, and sometimes it's hard EPAs we cannot, but we document all of it. And we say, although like EPA number whatever and whatever didn't reach the recommended number, however, according to the narrative on the clinical day, something in transfusion, this resident did very well, something like that. I guess it's going to be all about documentation, how you justify the decision you're making. Pervin, please correct me if I'm wrong, but as long as you document that you made this decision, although you didn't reach to the recommended number, however you think that the resident is competent according to the other tools that you used on this skills, I think we should be fine. Parvin, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, Ellie, I think that is completely right on. That is what the college has said, is that you just have to be able to show documentation to justify decision making, regardless of how you got there, and that it was group decision making, and across the fact that it's standardized across residents. So the same decision making tools are used with every single resident. So I think that's exactly right. I think it's got Val. I think, what, the numbers are a little bit, they're kind of nice because they're just an easy standard to use, right, amongst residents. And I think you're totally right. Everybody's saying the numbers are no good, we're really stressed, is actually the other coin of it. The other side of it is that it actually to try and find standardized decision making is actually going to be up to the competence committee decide how they're going to do it. And you may find, I guess, Val, as you go through, you may actually get a number that actually is maybe what is, you may find after a while that instead of 10, but you really, really need to have 5 or something like that. I think numbers really are numbers, but they do help to standardize it. And so I think it'll going to be a learning curve. I think it's easy to say numbers don't matter, but actually it's much, much, much harder to operationalize, which is what all of you have actually said. Maybe dependent, as Michael said, on the EPA, might be dependent on what other tools you're using, other than EPAs. All of those things probably have to go into decision making.
Ideally, the new visualization dashboard will help kind of look at those patterns as well.
Yeah.
As they evolve. And truly, CBD was intended to be individualized to the resident. Might take one resident more than the other, but at least you can start to look within cohort and have that more readily available to you at a glance. So the other, just to wrap, we can defer and wrap up, but it just kind of triggered another thing that has come up is the reluctance. I think this might drop off as programs go deeper into CBD over time, is the reluctance to relinquish ITERs and other assessment tools that have been in place. Not quite feeling that EPAs are going to get it all, and that's kind of true. It is to be a composite, but refining down that program of assessment. Have people really found kind of a nice balance over time? There's an issue of, residents feeling the burden of that, feeling over-assessed, faculty feeling burdened by doing a number of assessments. Has there been, especially through COVID, maybe enhanced use of simulation or other things that have eased the burden of other types of global assessments and WBAs? Or are you finding over time you're refining this program of assessment and it's getting lighter and more effective? Or is it a work in progress still?
So our program did away with ITERs, I think, before I started. So we don't have ITERs within otolaryngology. What I found, though, basically is because the EPAs are a big part, but not 100% of the assessments, as everyone has said. So I find that basically the committee, it turns out to be an informal verbal ITER, especially for residents who have concerns. And then in the letter to RPC, which I know is changing because it no longer needs ratification in the future, I find that that's almost like a mini ITER, because if there's any concerns with a resident, anything that's discussed in the committee, I kind of summarize in the letter to RPC. So that's kind of become our new makeshift ITER, even though we dropped ITERs. So that's what I found in the past year. But we did away with ITERs, so it definitely helps with the documentation burden, because especially with a smaller program, if we're doing the EPAs for all the residents, it does become a big burden. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why our program did away with ITERs for our residents. But I found that the CC chair basically is making a ITER within the letter.
That's really kind of really interesting, Mike, just because it does kind of indicate that your competence committee is actually going by verbal as opposed to documentation of performance in terms of, what your committee members are talking about. And I just wonder, maybe just hearing it may be working. It might be something to really think about if that's actually the way.
I think I'm probably wording it right in that the EPAs are all documented within the comments.
Yeah.
But I think especially with residents who were, for example, we failure to progress a resident, and as part of that decision, it's not based purely on EPA. So it's based on our other work-based assessments, and then we end up discussing the resident in more than just their inability to complete all the EPA. So that's kind of what I mean. It's not so much we're making a lot of our CC decisions kind of informally and verbally. What I'm getting at is, I guess, without ITERs in our program, I'm finding that in the residents who are failing to progress or not making progress, the letter to the resident encompasses all that information within the work-based assessment into a kind of a makeshift ITER in my letter to the RPC and resident.
I see.
So it's not so much making decisions without documentation, it's more without ITERs to have that documentation. I'm finding that my letter to RPC kind of almost becomes our new ITER.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I think one of the disconnects from the Royal College stop doing and the Royal College accreditation standard is that the Royal College says stop doing, evaluations that are, basically streamlined. However, in accreditation, they're looking at a systematic review assessment, which actually programs have been received an AFI for only using EPAs, even though when we all started off, we thought that that's where we would actually get to, which was probably naive. But so it's a bit of a real disconnect. The other thing that the college accreditor surveyors sometimes don't get I've seen it, is that the EPA sometimes are actually other forms of assessment, right? So one EPA may be that you need to get a 360, or another EPA, you need to have a teaching evaluation. So there's other modes of evaluation that is embedded in the EPA itself, and that doesn't seem to be recognized at accreditation meetings. I just was one at one last year. So I think, again, for all of you, when you come up for accreditation and you're discussing it, if you have other like a 360 teaching eval embedded in the EPA, you're using EPAs, is just to make that very clear to the surveyors, is that here's the EPA, but here's the 360 that EPA is based on. This is the other tool that we're using to actually fill this EPA. It's not, the EPA is not just medical expert and direct observation. It has other stuff attached to it. So I've always, and partly because I grew up on ITERs, I always love ITERs, even though we all recognize the badness of ITERs. But ITERs to me, actually, maybe in a way that is not having all 7 Chem Meds roll in every single ITER, is to really kind of make the ITER a bit of looking at all your EPAs and say, okay, what are the things that I'm actually missing, and make the ITER actually be that. The other thing the ITER gives, I think, for some programs is sometimes there's only one EPA attached to that rotation. And without having an assessment process, like, for example, when I have my heme clinic, I don't have any EPAs with the learners, none. I have yet to have a learner come up to me and say, can you do this EPA? So I rely on the end of rotation ITER to give my feedback, because there's not an EPA associated with the clinic. So ITERs, I think it still serves a role, but maybe not in the same format that we used to use, but maybe more of, again, the systematic things is here's what the EPAs are doing. And in between EPAs, or for longitudinal assessment, or for professionalism assessment, I'm going to use this particular tool. So I get the picture of the resident. But I really have actually thought that ITERs should be kept in some way, form, or other to give a longitudinal assessment. But I'm sometimes you're mired in the past. Can't get past it. So I don't know, Val, you've had the most experience. What do you think in terms of ITERs, no ITERs, or modified ITERs, really?
We, a number of years ago, I can't remember, whenever PGME was encouraging us to revise our ITERs, we did revise them so that all the Chem Meds roles aren't repeated on every single ITER, but each one will focus on certain ones. So they're spread across the 5 years. We still use ITERs. I think they're really valuable for us. Like I do personally think that there is a lot of information that comes from ITERs that we don't get out of EPAs, for us anyways. And similarly, we do have some rotations where maybe surgical foundations EPAs are caught, but there's no OB-GYN specific EPA. So the ITERs are only way of tracking or having some form of assessment.
Just a couple comments before we wrap. To that note, we have had modified IDers come in reduced to one page with an emphasis on narrative and what you've described, Val, and another that is really an end of rotation, completely narrative form that a program has adopted. So there is flexibility, and we're seeing that in practice. There is programs too that have designed and uploaded their own 360 form. CBD Form 3 is a multi-source feedback form, and it is triggered with specific EPAs in the system. But other programs have chosen to use their own, and they just upload it themselves. So there's that too. There's again variability, but programs adapting to what works. The other, for Ali on the call, we do, and I hope you received, have a very strong curriculum mapping workshop and 4 recommended maps to use. In addition to that, we have assessment mapping, which helps with that process of aligning your assessment tool with the particular competencies across the curriculum. Val is one of our facilitators, and she is also stepped up as a mentor with Sam Mugherjee for programs that are coming in 2023. So you've met Val, you can reach out around that part of the process too, if you feel you need to. And all of the curriculum and assessment mapping resources are under the drop-down resources on the CBD website. There's a whole page dedicated to it, and you can download the maps. It's very straightforward. And also the recorded workshops to take you through the process for anyone, actually. Anything else before we go? I'm just conscious we are just over time. I think I'm hoping that was fruitful conversation and useful. I learned things, and taking some things away from here that we can work on towards implementation. And I would suggest we wrap, if that's okay, if there's nothing more. I don't see anything in chat.
Thanks so much, everybody. And sorry we had to, so the problem with the Canadian winter.
Exactly.
So unreliable. Okay, so.
Yep. Rain check. For
rain
the
check for sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.